Our goal now is to create out a new route which shows a form that we can submit and respond to. And at the moment we haven't got databases or anything like that set up. We're going to do that later, but at least what we want to do is submit that form and extract the information out from that form. And what's going to come into this is something called cross-site request forgery, which we'll be talking about in this video because that relates to the submission of forms. So the first thing I want to do is create out a new route that renders out a form. So let's say posts/create. Maybe we're creating an application which allows us to go ahead and actually post something to the database. So we're going to reference our post controller. We haven't quite got a method just yet, but I'm going to call this create. And let's head over to our post controller and create this method out. So let's create out a method called create. And we know that we're going to return a view here because we want to output a form. So I'm going to go into posts and I'm going to create a view called create. So let's go over to our resources, over to views and posts, and let's create a create.blade.php file out. Okay, so we know that we can extend our base template. So let's grab this really simple show extension here, and over in that create file, let's just paste that in. And we're not using any styling here just for now, just to keep things simple. But let's create out a form here with a method of post. And let's create out an input here with a type of text. And let's call this title and give this an ID of title. Let's go down and create a button with a type of submit and just say post. So again, not accessible, not styled, but this will do for now. Okay, so we need to figure out where to post this through to. Okay, let's head over to the browser over on post create. You can actually see that we get the text create being output. Now, I'm glad we've come across this issue because if we go over to routes and web, notice the structure of our routes. We've got post/ID and post/create. What's happening here is Laravel is prioritizing this route here. So what's actually happening here in the URL is we're taking the value create, we're having that passed through to here, and this is the route that's being responded to. To get around this, we can just bump this up to the top, and then this will take priority. So if I give that a refresh now, we end up with our form, but we're still able to come over to post 1, post 2, or whichever ID we're trying to look up. Okay, so we've got our form out in here. Let's go over to our post controller, and we need now to be able to action this on a particular route. So we actually need to create a new route to create a post. The job of the new route that we're going to create will be to accept a post request and potentially store this in the database. So let's go ahead and create out a new route in here, this time with the post verb, because we're going to be posting through to this via that form. And we just want to say /post. We're going to keep this nice and restful and follow the same structure all the way down. So again, let's reference the post controller, but this time let's go ahead and reference a new method. I'm just going to call this store. Laravel has some conventions about naming, and I tend to just follow these. So create to show a form, index to list, show to show an individual item, and store to post something. So if we go over to the post controller, let's create out a new method here called store, and let's go ahead and just die dump and just say store, just so we can verify that this is working. Okay, so we need to reference this inside of our form. So of course what we could do is do /posts. That's perfectly fine. I'm going to show you another way to do that in just a minute. But let's just check that this works first of all. First thing I'm going to do is just turn autocomplete off, just so we don't get any suggestions. And I'm just going to say cats, for example. Let's go ahead and post this through. And now we end up with a new problem. And that is that we get a 419 page expired error. Now the reason for this is Laravel has cross-site request forgery protection enabled by default. Now cross-site request forgery protection basically protects forms against being posted not on your behalf. So on your behalf without you really knowing. And these are typically JavaScript attacks which execute scripts which post forms. Think of your bank account. Say you logged into your bank's website and you had a form that allowed you to make a deposit or transfer money to someone. That form needs to be protected because you wouldn't want an attacker to allow that form to be submitted on your behalf. Now, we're not talking bank security here, but we're at least talking that we don't want someone to post something on our behalf because that could potentially be embarrassing. Now, just before we look at how we fix this up in our form, I'm going to head over to our middleware section again. So let's go over to HTTP and middleware, and we're going to look at the kernel here. So let's scroll up, and just check inside of our web routes. Cross-site request forgery protection doesn't really apply to API routes because they're stateless, but with this verify cross-site request forgery token middleware, what this will do is anytime we send a post request, a delete request, or a patch request through to our application, it's going to check that a token has been provided in the form. Now you can open this middleware up. This exists just within your middleware directory. It looks pretty bare at the moment. That's just because this extends the base middleware from the Laravel code itself, the Laravel code base. And you can go ahead and open that up, but you don't want to modify that because that's within your composer's vendor file. And you can see here, if we just come down, we've got a handle method here, which will go ahead and do a couple of checks, and it will respond with a token mismatch exception if this fails, which will be rendering that view out that we just saw. We don't really need to dive into that just yet. We kind of just need to know how to get this form submitted. So we have a post request here. Let's go over to our form and look at how we do this inside of our form. Now, what Laravel will do is it will look for a hidden input with the name of token with a particular value. And this cross-site request forgery value is generated by Laravel behind the scenes. You don't need to do this yourself, but we basically just want to get this in the form. Now we have a blade directive, which we've already looked at, called cross-site request forgery. So we know what a directive is. It's kind of like a function within blade templates. What this directive will do just by adding this to our form is generate out that token input, that hidden input for us. Let's go back over to post/create and just see what that's done by viewing the page source. You can see here that we end up with the hidden input with the name of token, as we just talked about, with that hidden value, which is stored in a session just for you, and only you know that value. So just by adding that to our form, what we can now do is go ahead and post this successfully through to the route that we just created. Okay, so what we now want to look at is how we actually grab this information. Now, we've given this a name of title, we've given it an ID of title, but that's really just so we can hook it up to a label for accessibility. But over in our post controller, how would we get this information that we've posted through? Now, normally, if you're coming from just a plain vanilla PHP background, you would do something like use the post superglobal array to access that value. So we know that we've called that title. Let's just see what happens when we do that and resubmit this form. Sure enough, that does work, but the best way to do this within Laravel is to utilize the request object, which can be accepted into any of your controller methods. So by that I mean we're going to accept in a type hinted request object. Now this request object contains information about the request, obviously, that has just been made to your application. By default, this is already pulled in when you use Artisan to generate out a controller, so you don't need to import that. Let's just dump on that and see what happens. So you can see here we've got a huge amount of information about the request. So about the query string, any files that have been submitted through, any cookies that we have set, which will be listed in here, and headers and all that kind of stuff. But this also gives us information about anything that's been posted through to a form. So for example, if we wanted to grab the title, we would use the get method on the request object, and we just give the name of the value that we want to extract. Let's give that a refresh, and sure enough, we get exactly the same thing. Much cleaner than using the post superglobal array. What's also great about this is things have already been done for us. So for example, we've got this trims strings middleware, which will trim any left and right white space off of the end of a string. So it's always a good idea to use the request object, even if it takes a little bit of getting used to. Okay, so another way that we can do things is dynamically extract this data out. So I could just say request title. That's a lot easier to write. It looks a little bit better. And when I go ahead and resubmit that form, you can see we get exactly the same thing. So that's pretty much it about submitting forms. You know how to build up a form now, use cross-site request forgery, go ahead and define inputs, and these could be multiple inputs, and submit this through to a particular route, and then pick the data up. And with this title, we could go ahead and store that in the database, redirect the user off to the post that they just created, and we'd pretty much have a simple app set up and ready to go. We'll get there within this course, but let's just really quickly talk about this action. Now, like I said earlier, over in our web routes, we can give names to our routes. So I could give, say, the post index a name of posts slash or post.index if I wanted to. That makes it easier to reference things. Now with the post create route, I could easily just go ahead and add a name to this called post create. You don't need to use a dot here, but what I tend to do is use the thing I'm acting on and then the action I'm acting on. I could even call this .store to keep in line with the method name. The point is, now we've got a name, what we could do is we could use Laravel's root function to reference this inside of here instead of just using /posts. Again, if our posts URI changed, we'd have to go ahead and update this in the form, which it doesn't happen often, but I always prefer to just use the root helper. So I'm going to use the blade syntax here to output a built-in function within Laravel called root. What this will do is it will allow you to get the full URI of a root by its name that you've given. We know that the name is posts.store, so we can take that and we can reference that inside of here. There are a couple of other options we can pass through to here, which we'll get to at some point, but if we go over to post/create and we view the page source, you can see that that's basically just given us, if we find the form, localhost 8000/post. And the benefit of this, of course, is that you get the full URL to your application as well, which is of course localhost 8000. So I'd always recommend using the root helper inside of your forms as long as you have names for all of your roots. Okay, so we're submitting this form, but we're not doing any validation. We could technically submit this without entering a title, and to post something, you would essentially require a title. So let's head over to the next part and see how easy validation is in Laravel.